This is the ultimate editing guide for HDR environmental portraits while maintaining good skin tones, going from raw files like this to final images like this one. Best of all, we're going to do it in 5 simple steps. My name is Pi. I've been fortunate to create multiple successful companies in the photography space. I'm a photographer, but even more so, I would say I'm an educator and frameworks person. My specialty? Making complex subjects easy for you to master, right here on Adorama TV. Hello, my friends. My name is Pi. Welcome to Adorama TV. Let's get straight into this. If you're an SLR Lounge Premium member, you can actually download the exact exercise file for this tutorial, or if you'd like, just load up an image of your own. We're going to work through this in specific steps so you guys can understand from shoot all the way through to post how to pull off this look. Okay, we have 5 specific steps in post, but we do have 1 step in pre-production or in shooting the image. So we're going to label that as step 0. Step 0, I want you guys to shoot raw so you can maximize image detail and information. This is really important to getting, well, the best possible look and effect from this technique. I also want you to maximize dynamic range when you're shooting. And what this means is if you look at the histogram, the best way to do this, by the way, is to make sure that you're using your histogram as you're shooting. What you want to see in a properly exposed raw image is a histogram that's basically maximized for detail. You have as much shadow as possible and you're allowing your camera to pick up as much highlights as it possibly can. Now this is shot on the Canon R5, and here's the thing. There's some cameras like Sony cameras that can pick up even more shadow detail and still give you clean results. I'd recommend knowing your gear so that way you know exactly where you can expose, because if I were to take a Canon file down, like let's say on a Sony A7R4 or whatever, A7, I could be able to probably pull this down an extra stop, maybe even 2 stops, and still get clean shadows. But on my Canon, if I were to shoot this dark, my shadows are likely going to be a little bit muddy. So what I would recommend is expose as dark as you possibly can to maintain shadow detail without getting muddy shadows, and allow the camera to pick up whatever highlights it can. If some of the highlights kind of peak and they kind of blow out a little bit, that's okay. It's kind of natural, and it's well, more natural to the eye than shadows that appear muddy. But what you want is a histogram that looks somewhat like this, as much detail as possible being captured. In fact, if I press J to bring up my highlight and clipping alert, you'll notice in this raw file that there's only a tiny, tiny bit of the sky being blown out. So your histogram in camera, as well as your highlight and clipping alert in camera, is going to be your best tools to maximizing detail. Let's take the best possible image into post to get the best possible results. Okay, now let's get into the steps as far as post-production. All right, let's get to step 1 of post-production, which is to maximize tone and dynamic range. So before worrying about color and contrast and all the details of the image, we want to first get the dynamic range back. And I'm going to show you exactly what that means. I'm inside of Lightroom Classic now. We're in the develop module. This is where you want to load up the exercise file or an image of your choice. And let's do this. I'm going to correct the horizon on this so I don't trigger my OCD with every image we go to. And I'm going to go ahead and create a virtual copy by pressing Control or Command apostrophe so that we can see each step that we're making adjustments to. One of the big things that we're worrying about. So right now, to maximize dynamic range and tone, what we would do is basically pull the highlights down, pull the whites down. Okay, this preserves our sky detail. And then we would bring shadows up and bring blacks up. Okay. The problem with this is that in doing this, we're creating a lot of artifacts. It's unusual color. We're creating some, grain. We're creating a lot of different things, some posterization, and just abnormal skin tones as well. See, I'm going to show you an example of this. So what we have to do is make a lot of different adjustments to color and to, grading and to the tone curve and everything. And if you're using Visual Flow presets, you actually would see that. So each of these preset packs, they're developed based on lighting conditions, right? So depending on what kind of look we want to go for, let's say that we want modern, this kind of overall warm look, and we want an HDR vibe. What that's going to do is very much tweak those highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks accordingly. But it's going to, if you look down here, it's actually going to make tons of adjustments to HSL and to color and to everything to preserve the natural color of the image while adapting it to that preset. So look, this is the mistake that we often make in HDR is we make these types of adjustments, add in some contrast, And then we get really kind of crazy over the top results as opposed to something that's more natural. So each of the visual flow packs have this HDR preset that's basically building everything in, and you simply choose the look that you want to have, and then you would adjust your temperature and exposure beyond that. But we're not working from that place. We're going to do this from scratch. So I'm going to go back to this image right here, and I'm actually going to just click back again and hit previous so we get our settings. What I want to do now is I don't want you to worry about contrast yet. I want to save that as a final adjustment. So for now, what we're going to do is bring our highlights down, bring our white point kind of down, maybe around there, and shadows and blacks up. And then we're going to go down to the tone curve. So we're worrying first about basically overall tone and dynamic range. So we've pulled all our dynamic range back. Now using the tone curve, I'm going to add a little bit of brightness by pulling up on the highlights, pulling down on the shadows, and we get a much more clean contrast from this. Okay, I'm even going to bring the midpoints up a little bit, and already the image is starting to look much better than it simply did with that. This was just the basic adjustment here with just contrast, right? We're already getting more clean skin tones over here, which it's a subtle shift on your side, and you might not be able to see it as well in the video, but I can see it especially over skin. Let's do one other thing too. I might actually make an adjustment here to temperature, just to warm up the temperature a bit. So let's go to 7,500 so we see equal on each side. Already we're getting to a much better place. If you want to make any additional tweaks, you totally can. I'm gonna pull my tone curve up a little bit, knowing that in the end, I'm going to teach you also how to bring attention to our subject. That's going to be the last and final step. So for right now, I'm not too worried if we lose a little bit of the sky or if it gets a little bit bright. And by the way, these guys, they're a quick and easy Photoshop job. Let's get to step 2. Now, this is where we get to HSL. This is where we want to modify, not only for kind of the color grade and the look that we want the image to have, but we also want to modify based on what becomes oversaturated. So let's go first and click the eyedropper tool and go to the oranges, because my yellows and oranges are getting a bit oversaturated when I create this look and effect, right? So I'm going to bring it up a little bit, and just be careful because yellows are more so background, but oranges are skin tone. So if you go too far in the oranges, you're going to kill a lot of your skin tone in the shot. I'm also noticing that my blues, this is very much preferential, like this is completely subjective. For me, my blues are getting a little bit too much, so I'm gonna pull them back so it's a bit more subtle. But if you really like them where they're at, then keep them where they're at. If you wanna make them more exaggerated, you totally can. I'm also gonna bring my reds back. Let's pull the magentas. I don't think there's too many magentas in this image, but I'm gonna pull them back nonetheless. And I usually will actually pull greens down quite a bit. You just don't really see it on an image like this one as well. If you want to change in the hues, you can. Change luminance, you can. If you wanted to, go to the blues and say darken them down a little bit so that way they kind of pop a little more, you could do that too. I sometimes like to pull some of the saturation out of the blues and then darken them just a bit to get it down. Now this is where we could also go back up to temperature and make a little modification here, because now I can further warm the image because we pulled out a little bit of the oversaturation to the image, right? So I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna warm it. I'm gonna make some tweaks along the way. I'm gonna add a little bit of the exposure. Okay, and I kind of tend to like my images a bit warmer too, so this is also stylistic. But look at, with each of these adjustments, this was just basically just kind of fast tracking it, just going contrast and exposure. Look at the difference between this. If I were to match the exposure so that you see kind of the same level of, let's see the same level of contrast too. So you see the same level of brightness in the subject as well as contrast. Notice that the tone information on this one is much, much cleaner, more subtle, and it's more refined, which is exactly what I'm wanting to go for, okay? You can also make some tweaks, by the way, if you want to add a little bit. Sometimes I'll add a little bit of clarity, put in a little bit of dehaze. Dehaze will tend to make colors go wonky, just FYI. So if you're adding dehaze, you're going to have to make some significant adjustments to temperature and tint. Okay, this looks nice. Now, step 3 is if you want to add color grading, you can do that here. So once you've done basic color adjustments, this is where you'd go down and add any color grading. So we can go to, let's say what I often do is go to like highlights, and I'll add a little bit. And by the way, these colorways will kind of like, they're finicky to adjust from that tri view, that triple view. I don't know, the color wheel view, whatever you want to call it. Anyway, what we're going to do is actually go individually and go to highlights, and I might add like a little bit of like yellows to the highlights, somewhere around here-ish. getting a little bit of warmth into my highlights, okay? And I don't want to go too far, because if I go too far, it kind of gives the image an overall tint, and I don't want that. I usually like to use color grading to kind of very subtly dial into a look, okay? And for this, I'm gonna go to kind of like oranges for the midtones, and let's pull up the saturation just a little bit. You can play around here and see what you like. I'm just gonna add a tiny bit of warmth almost across the board, maybe a little bit even in the shadows as well. But again, keeping the balance very, very light on each of these. Notice that the saturation is around 5, and I'm gonna shift the blending towards the highlight side as well. And if you wanna tweak the balance, you can too. These are just subtle fine-tuning adjustments. But what's happening when I turn this on and off, what you notice is that this subtle amount of color, and it might be difficult to see on your guys' side, but you can see this subtle amount of color kind of shift and pull all the tones together. It makes everything more unified, which I really love about it. Now this brings us to step 4. This is the place where I'm actually going to start to adjust contrast, because now I can see exactly what I want in my image. I have the tone, I have the color, I have everything dialed in. Before this, it was kind of just adjusting blind. So what I'm actually going to do is bring back a little bit of the blacks. I'm going to bring back a little bit of the shadows. I'm going to affect contrast first by hitting these before I ever touch the slider. And the reason for this is that the contrast slider is a heavy-handed adjustment. It's going to adjust everything equally, just like saturation down here. That's why I'm usually adding vibrance to an image before I'm adding saturation, or I'm adjusting saturation individually, not with the overall slider. So I leave contrast usually zeroed out, especially for presets, because that's kind of a final adjustment that I want to have on an individual image-to-image basis. I'm going to press J to look at my highlight and clipping alert, and this looks beautiful. Don't worry, we're not done yet. We do have a bright HDR look to this, but I want to get a little bit more of the color back. Now this is where you're going to go to step 5. And what I'm going to do is create a virtual copy at this place. So this is with, let's go ahead and just do a quick comparison right now. So this is, if we were to match brightness, color, and everything, sorry, if we were to match exposure and contrast, right? This is no adjustments to color. This is just maximizing dynamic range and doing it the kind of quick and dirty way. And let's make sure our white balance is the same too. Okay, so quick and dirty contrast and maximize dynamic range. This is where we've actually adjusted everything independently. Look at the difference between the skin tones on this. It's kind of wild. And maybe a close-up would be helpful to see that side by side. But now we're going to take this one step further. Step 5 is where you're going to make your local adjustments to continue to recover background. My favorite way of doing this, you can make a preset for this, by the way. Go ahead and click Select Subject. You're going to press apostrophe to invert that mask. And now we're going to start pulling down the background. Okay, so I'm going to say negative, I'm going to go to negative 0.7 because there's more that I want to do to the background. Okay, so I'm also going to bring down the blacks a little bit. I'm also going to bring down the shadows a little bit. Okay, if you want to tweak the highlights and the whites, you can. I kind of like the whites coming up a little bit and maybe the highlights going down. So this is a nice adjustment. And if I turn on and off this mask, look at this significant difference that has in and of itself, right? Next thing that we're going to do is I'm going to add another one of these. We're going to go to a radial gradient. I'm going to pull that directly over my subjects, press apostrophe to invert it, and I'm going to add a bit of a vignette to this. I'm going to do it one more time, this time with a linear gradient that's affecting just the sky and just kind of the top of the sky. Okay. Now, anything that I notice that gets too much contrast, like for example, when I'm looking at the background, I'm noticing too much contrast now in the shadows of this. I'm going to come back and just adjust that back up, maybe to +5. Okay, that looks a lot more natural. I can also tweak my exposure a bit. If some of those gradients kind of pull over your subject and you want to adjust that down a little bit, that's totally fine too. The last thing that I can do is I can also leave my exposure a little bit lower, and I can go one more time to select subject. Sometimes what I like to do is lift the subject out with just some highlights. So I can actually add highlights right to their person. And I'm actually going to make sure I maintain the shadows too. So I'm going to add a little bit and add a little bit of shadow. And I might even reduce a little bit of the clarity on them just to soften the overall look and effect. Okay, this is looking pretty incredible now. So now what we've done is we've added back all the detail in the sky, and it was there because we had to make sure that we maximize dynamic range in that edit, right? Or in the shot. Let's go down, let's make one little tweak down here. I'm gonna go to detail, and I'm just gonna zoom in and look at the shadows and blacks on this side. A lot of times we get a little bit of grain introduced on stuff like this when we make these kind of adjustments. So what I'll do is I'll actually pull up my noise reduction to around +40, and I'll bring up the color noise reduction as well, and give it a little bit of sharpening as well. And this is starting to look fantastic. From here, you can finalize your white balance. I'm seeing a little bit too much pink, so I'm just kind of pulling it down towards the green side a little bit. And now look at this. So this is where that quick and dirty, this is where oftentimes we try to do these really fast HDR edits and we just pull highlights and whites and we end up with kind of these muddy overall colors. And I'm like, okay, this is where I want it to be and this is what looks good. But this is actually a clean HDR edit where we have beautiful skin tones. We have our subjects kind of highlighted. And the last thing to do would just be to take this into Photoshop, do a quick selection, just have it automatically remove those guys from the background. But that's how we edit an HDR environmental portrait. Now, I want to show you one last thing. There's a reason that we always encourage people to create their own tools or invest in good tools, because what I'm going to do is reset this whole thing out. We're going to get our crop back. And then check this out. I'm going to start with that HDR natural for the modern pack, right? We'll dial this to the exact same temperature and everything, the same tint, which is about here and right there. I've made a preset actually for those spotlighting adjustments, those AI-based adjustments for the background. And we're going to build this actually into future Visual Flow tools as well. So what it's going to do is automatically select, and this looks fantastic. So this is how we would do it very quickly in just a couple simple steps. And you can continue making adjustments, but it already looks fantastic from here. We get the full HDR look and we're done. So whether you are investing in other tools or creating your own, we'd recommend putting all this stuff into presets so that you can really maximize your workflow, get in and out and back to shooting. I hope you all enjoyed the video. Now, if you're on Adorama TV, you know what to do. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel so you guys can see me back here same time at same place next week. Also, comment below, let me know what you thought about the video. I get a lot of ideas from your guys' comments, and I do my best to reply to each of them as well. In the meantime, you guys can follow me at PyJersa. You guys can learn more about SLR Lounge workshops at slrloungeworkshops.com and Visual Flow presets at vfpresets.com. And I'll see you all next time. Peace.